Hello, I am Anne and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be wrapping up the books that I read in June of 2022. So I do have one DNF I'm going to get into before I get to any of the books that I read, and that is The Rise and Reign of the Mammals, A New History from the Shadow of the Dinosaurs to Up by Stephen Brusette. I had this in my anticipated historical releases of, was it June or May? I don't remember, but I was excited for this book to come out. It looked interesting, and I started it, and I got maybe about 50 pages in before I was like, yeah, we're not doing this. So I stopped it. The other one I DNF'd is part of one of the readathons. The two readathons I did, and then I'll get to all the rest of the books. And I won't be talking about a lot of the books that I read in the first half of the month, just because I did do a mid-month wrap-up. So, for June on the Range, which is a Western-themed readathon that took place in June, I read 4 books for that, and I documented all my thoughts on them in either my mid-month wrap-up, or I also did a vlog where I read 2 of the books. So the first one I read was Log a Cowboy by Andy Adams. Loved this, 4 out of 5 stars. The second one was Bridge of the Gods by F.H. Balk. I had some issues with this. I also wasn't a huge fan of the ending, so I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Still okay, still interesting, but not great. Then I read Lure of the Dim Trails, which I also gave 3 stars, but I feel like I like that more, by B.M. Bauer. This one was about a young author from New York City who just decides one day, you know what? I need to go survive in the Old West. So he goes back to where his father's farm was in the West, and he ends up meeting this guy who's like, oh, you want to join a cowherd or whatever? And so he joins this group, and then he falls in love in the meantime, and it's a bit ridiculous, but it's also quite endearing. But I enjoyed it. I liked it more than The Bridge of the Gods, but there were different elements that I enjoyed and not enjoyed in each. And the last one I read for June on the Range, which I ended up DNFing. I know, I'm horrible. Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. Here's the thing. I ranted about it in my vlog that I did a week or so ago, but I didn't give full thoughts as to my issues with this book. This book follows 2 ex-Texas Rangers who decide to steal some cattle and go from Texas to Montana? I don't remember. Across several states to sell them. And so it follows their group. In my vlog, I said one thing I hated was how prostitution was described in this book, because it's described as a fun, light thing and not really horrific for the women who endured that during the Old West, because a lot of them, they didn't have a choice, and they had to endure getting pregnant, getting horrible venereal and sexually transmitted diseases. It was a hard life as a prostitute. And of course they make it all nice and fun, and all these guys are sleeping with this girl. So that was one of my issues I had with it, is just the depiction of the women in this book. But I think there's an overarching main issue I had with this book that I didn't discuss in the vlog. My dad was huge fan of John Wayne, all the old Western movies from the 40s and the 50s. He owned the complete collection of Louis L'Amour, so he loved the old Westerns. So those were the only Westerns I either read or watched movies of. So that is where I get my perception of Westerns from, is the old Westerns. And this was written, I believe, in the early 80s. So it's a more recent Western. And I think the issue with this is, in the original Western stories, and what I love about Western tales, is that they are about moral individuals seeking justice. Now that may be a revenge type story. That may be that they're just cowboys that are going about their business and have to fight the bad guy or whatever. There's a lot of different ways that plot manifests itself. But I think there's a strong sense of morality in old Westerns in the 40s and 50s, the ones that I grew up with. And with this, it doesn't have any of that. All the characters are kind of immoral, they have their own morals and they don't really have any ethical code that they stick to. They don't like try to fight for justice. And one of the most famous movies I can think of that is a great example of this is The Magnificent Seven, starring Yul Brynner. Loved that movie growing up. That was a great movie. They actually made a remake recently. The remake, Morgan Freeman starred as the main guy, I think, and I enjoyed that one, but it's not as good as the original. But basically in that one, it just follows these 7 guys that are all over the place. You know, one's like a gambler, like a knife thrower. I don't remember like all their situations, but these are not necessarily good guys. You know, they're not all like moral, upright individuals. However, they come together and fight for this little tiny village that is being attacked by these bandits and don't really have that much money to pay them. They decide to fight. Spoilers, sacrifice their lives for this little town of no significance. And even though these men aren't like all amazing, upright, moral men, they are fighting for good and justice. And I think that's what I loved typically about Westerns, and this was completely lacking in it. There was no like, yeah, maybe these are imperfect characters, but they're really fighting for something good, or like they're realizing that they have to not do what they're doing, that they have to be moral, that they have to fight against something evil. There's none of that. There's just like, oh yeah, these guys are just going around their everyday lives, stealing cattle and driving them across the plain and like sleeping with prostitutes. And yeah, there was just no goodness in this book, and I think that's the main issue I had with it. So yeah, I DNF'd this about 320 some pages in, and because it's like 1,000-page book, I was like, I'm not enduring like 7 more 100 pages of this. The second readathon I did actually went much better, I will say. The first one I read that I planned to read was City of God by St. Augustine. This one was not at all what I was expecting. So my plan was to only read half of this month. So I think I got up to page 550 or something, and I may end up reading more of it next month. We will see. So in like 410 AD, I believe, Rome was sacked, and there were many proponents that claimed that it was due to the rise of Christianity in the Roman world. So St. Augustine, who lived around that time, decided to write a vindication for Christianity and say, no, these were the reasons that the Roman Empire fell. On one hand, yes, he gets into Christian theology and talks about like the beliefs and some like very philosophical discussions on like different topics like angels and sin and things like that. But then on the other hand, he's also examining the Roman culture from its inception, its beginning, even some like Greek stuff. He even like talks about Homer at one point, and trying to break that down as to see like, no, it wasn't Christianity that caused Rome to fall in a sense and grow so weak that it could be invaded, but that instead it was their own corruption from within and how the whole system itself was flawed. Especially, he examines mostly their myths and how they saw their gods, and kind of took that as a jumping point to kind of understand how Roman society was organized. And so it was really fascinating. I would say for the first like 300 pages, Augustine doesn't really get into Christianity all that much. Yeah, he may like compare it a little bit to Roman culture, but most of all, it is trying to understand why Rome became so weak and understand what Roman culture was like. So that I was not expecting that at all, because I was expecting like this to be like a very Christian theological book, and it wasn't at all. But then for, up till like page 300 up till when I stopped it at like 550 something, it became much more of a like work of Christian theology, kind of examining different beliefs. And then like I didn't enjoy it as much because it's so dense and it's so hard to read. And yeah, I flipped back between like the physical format and the audiobook format, and the audiobook format definitely helped me to like read it quicker. So yeah, a great, interesting read, but also one that was not what I was expecting. So the second big book that I finished for the Ancientsathon was The Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. I'm so glad I finally was able to read this. I did a better summary in my mid-month wrap-up, so go watch that if you want to see the details of that, but I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And the next one I also read in the first half of the month was Love in the Turning Year, 100 More Poems from the Chinese. And this one, again, I really liked. I gave it also 4 out of 5 stars. And the last book I read for Ancientsathon was The Complete Plays of Sophocles. This was written around 400 BC. Like, a lot of the characters that are included in his plays come from the Iliad and the Odyssey. So like Odysseus, Ajax, people like that, they're from the Iliad and the Odyssey. So they're familiar for like the general Greek reader, both of that time and of the modern day. Like if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you'll notice some references. Each play is very dramatic. It's like an ancient Greek soap opera, it feels like. And like it's so silly. So one of my favorite plays was Antogony. Antogony was the daughter of Oedipus, and if anyone knows his story, he's the one that was doomed to like kill his father and marry his mother, and so he tried everything to not do it, and he ended up realizing that he had done it, and then he like plucked out his eyes. Anyways, great story. That was one of the ones that I read. That was Oedipus Rex, but Antogony was his daughter, and she tries to bury her brother, even though Creon, the king at the time, is like, yeah, no, you're not going to do that. I'm going to like imprison you and kill you. And so his son comes to Cleon, and he's like, yeah, I love this woman. I'm going to marry her. Don't do that. The king ignores him and is like, yeah, whatever. So his wife comes to him and she's like, yeah, don't do that. And then like this wise man comes to him and he's like, yeah, don't do that. And he does it. Creon does that and kills her. And then his son commits suicide and his wife commits suicide, and the wise man is like, I'm out. That's ridiculous. And then of course the Creon is like, oh yeah, I made a mistake. So all these plays are very ridiculous, but they're all supposed to have like a main theme of like, don't seek revenge. This is what happens when you seek revenge. Don't mess with the gods, or they'll cause you to lose your mind and then fall on your sword and die. I'm looking at you, Ajax. So I loved these plays, but they were also a bit ridiculous. But it really helped. I read these as I watched them on stage on like YouTube, or they also had some like readings with multiple voices on YouTube. So I really found it helpful to watch it or hear the voices, because that's how Greek tragedies are supposed to be performed. They're not supposed to be read as you would read a book. They're supposed to be like played on stage. The same thing as reading Shakespeare. I like to like watch a depiction of Shakespeare plays as I'm reading it. So I would highly recommend it. But this was so great. I really liked this copy. And 2, all these plays were very amusing. I think I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars just because some of them were just a little bit over the top and ridiculous, but other ones were just so good and fun, and I liked them. So yeah, I had a lot of fun this month with Ancientsathon, and I think I liked every book that I read for Ancientsathon, so that was great. That was fun. I should read more like very old historic works more often. Now let's just go through all the books that I read not for any readathon. So the first half of the month I'm just going to run through quickly because I've wrapped them all up in my mid-month wrap-up. But basically I have Homefront Murder and Death on a Deadline by Joyce St. Anthony. Both cozy mysteries, part of a series, World War II. Then I read Malice by John Gwynne with my husband, and we did a whole very long book review for that, so I highly recommend you watch that. I gave that 5 out of 5 stars because it was great. Oh, and the 2 mysteries I gave 4 out of 5 stars each. The next one I read was The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, which I gave 3 out of 5 stars. Some things I liked about it, some things I really didn't like about it. The Wrong Family by Taryn Fisher, I gave 1 star. I really didn't like it. So that was fun. Then I finished Jane Austen's England by Roy A. Adkins. This was really good. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it. Then The White Mirror by Elsa Hart. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Murder mystery. Really good, set in 18th century China. In fact, I will wrap up the other one too because I read the 3rd book of the series, which is City of Ink by Elsa Hart, and it really puts together the series and brings it all together. I'm not sure if Elsa Hart is planning to write more books of the series, but I would definitely read them if she did, because I love the series so much. But since this came out like I think 4 or 5 years ago, it doesn't look that good. So we'll see. But this one follows Li Du when he goes into Beijing, whereas the first and the second book follow him like out in the countryside of China, in like the midst of China and Tibet. So quite different setting, but both of them are really, really good books. The next one I read was Gory Details by Erica Engelhaupt. I read this for the Black Hearts Book Club, hosted by Very Literary Carrie. This book was traumatizing. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars just because I think that it felt like it went too far sometimes, like it was just trying to be graphic for the sake of being graphic, but it was interesting. Let's get to the books that I haven't talked about. The first one I finished was The Life of Thomas More by Peter Ackroyd. This was a very dense book. In fact, it took me like all of last month and all of this month to read it. If you hear Loki in the background, it's because he has a rawhide and he's chewing it currently. But this book was... Yes, it was about the life of Thomas More, but it was very detailed on understanding the society and culture of 15th and 16th century England. So I loved it. It gets into all these details. It's very dense, which is why it took me so long to read, because I really struggled with just how much information there was. It goes from Thomas More's childhood all the way to his death, and you really learn not only what kind of person he was, but the political and social and religious climate of the era in which he lived. And really, really interesting. A lot of famous individuals are featured in this book, and you kind of see him because he was a lawyer, and he came from I wouldn't say a poor family, but very middle-class family. And he kind of worked his way up to being, you know, an advisor to Henry VIII and one of the most, like, respected men in all of England. And then, of course, because he didn't agree with Henry VIII, divorcing Catherine of Aragon and marrying Anne Boleyn, he was executed. So, really interesting individual, especially since Peter Ackroyd takes a very secular view on Thomas More's life. I've read couple of Thomas More's books, and I've also read I think it's called The Portrait of Thomas More. I'll put it here. I don't remember who the author is, but I read that, and that is very much a more religious view of his life. Especially that one focuses more on the end of his life, whereas this one is very much a secular. It doesn't get highly into understanding the religious aspects of his life. Yes, it does when it like has to do with social structures, but it doesn't have like direct impact on like how this book is written. It's not from a religious perspective. So I don't think either is like a wrong way to write it, by the way. I think like I learn more about him looking at both sides, understanding from more like a religious perspective as well as just understanding from like a secular type perspective. So really exceptional book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I succeeded in reading 10 stories from the English detective stories. There's some authors that obviously everyone knows, you know, Dorothy L. Sayers, Agatha Christie has one in here, G.K. Chesterton, but most of these I'd never heard of. Most of these authors wrote anywhere between like the 1920s and the 1960s, I believe it goes all the way to. So I only got 200 pages in, which are more than the 10 stories. I was hoping to finish them all this month, but that obviously didn't happen. Maybe I'll roll it over to next month, but I don't feel like it. Some of these weren't that great. There were ones that were really great, really good. But then there were other ones that I was like, this is just like very mediocre. So I don't know if I'll be keeping this book after I finish it. For all the books I read, I would probably give them an average of 3 stars. Some were really great, like 5 stars. Some were like, and I would give them, like 2 stars. All right. And the final book I read this month, Wild Swans by Zheng Chang. Oh, this book. So I took a class studying World War II, and specifically we just studied from the perspective of Japan. But during that time, we also spent like a class or two studying the Chinese reaction to everything that was going on during World War II. And this book follows this family from the 20s up to the 70s. And even though I know the history of China during that time, I'm familiar with it, I've taken classes in that, but to see it from like such a personal level, because Zheng Cheng was raised during the Cultural Revolution. She was born in 52, and her mother was born in 30 something, and then her grandmother was born in like 1910 or something. Her grandmother was a concubine to a warlord. Yeah, they had warlords back then. And then her mother married, you know, a man quite high up in the Cultural Revolution. Well, the Communist Party before Mao took over China. And then, of course, Zheng Cheng grew up during these changing times. And eventually in the 70s, she went to Great Britain. And she eventually wrote this book. This book was incredible. Not only is it just well-crafted book, it's beautifully written, just the descriptions, everything, pacing, just everything is wonderful. But also, it's just so wonderful to see from the perspective of these three women, this very changing time during China. You know, her grandmother had bound feet. Yes, bound feet, which is strange to think of because nobody in China has bound feet anymore unless they're like 80 or 90. Zheng Cheng was born during the Cultural Revolution, like such a crazy time, starvation and complete indoctrination into like this Mao cult. Such a fascinating book. I know everyone on BookTube, I feel like everyone on BookTube, but I know it was just like some people on BookTube read this last month. And yeah, so I'm a little bit late, but I'm glad that I made myself read this, even if it was a month late, because yeah, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It was an incredible read. So those are all the books that I finished this month. So have you read any of these books? Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe. I post every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!